What I'm about to tell you will change how you think about debt forever. In the winter of 1971, while every farmer in Knox County, Nebraska, was rushing to buy brand new John Deere tractors, one man made a decision that would save his life. His name was Vernon Hastings, and everyone thought he was a fool. Vernon was 43 years old, lean and weathered, farming 420 acres with a 1952 Oliver 88 tractor that looked like it belonged in a museum. The paint was faded. The seat was patched with vinyl. His neighbors whispered that he was farming himself into the ground. But Vernon had something they didn't have, a deed with no mortgage hanging over it. And that difference was about to matter more than anyone could imagine. Because while Vernon was rebuilding his ancient tractor in a cold machine shed, his neighbors were signing loans they'd never be able to repay. And none of them saw what was coming. Dal Kirkman showed up at Vernon's farm in March 1971, driving a gleaming John Deere 4020, 91 horsepower, 8 forward speeds, power steering. It cost $60,800, about $52,000 in today's money. Dale found Vernon under his Oliver, transmission parts spread across a tarp, grease up to his elbows. "You're tearing into that thing again," Dale said, shaking his head. "Vernon, it's 1971. You're farming like it's 1952. Vernon slid out from under the tractor, wiping his hands on a rag. "This antique put in 300 acres of corn last spring without missing a beat. How many times did you have to adjust the carburetor? How many times wouldn't the starter turn over?" Dale's voice had an edge to it now. "That Oliver is going to leave you stranded in the field one day. Then what? You'll lose your planting window. Your yields will drop. You'll be further behind than ever." Vernon looked at his neighbor for a long moment. "Or maybe I'll keep fixing it, keep farming, and keep my land paid for." Dale didn't respond. He just climbed back into his new tractor and drove away, dust rising behind him. But Vernon's words hung in the air like a prophecy. By May of 1971, 3 more neighbors had bought new tractors. Jim Peterson got a John Deere 4320 with 135 horsepower and air conditioning. Air conditioning in a tractor. Vernon couldn't wrap his head around it. Ray Stoltz bought a 4020 like Dale's. Warren Bickle traded up from an old Farmall to a brand new 3020. The bank was making it easy. Too easy. Gordon Clem, the young loan officer at Farmers State Bank, drove out to Vernon's place in June in a brand new Buick. He found Vernon greasing the Oliver's steering linkage and pulled out a folder from under his arm. "Mr. Hastings, I've been reviewing the loan portfolios for farm equipment in the county, and I noticed you haven't financed any new machinery in over a decade." Vernon kept working the grease gun. "Haven't needed to?" "Well, that's one way to look at it," Gordon said, his smile too wide. "But another way is that you're missing out on significant tax advantages, depreciation benefits, and productivity gains. I can approve you for up to $15,000 based on your land equity. 3. 9% fixed for 5 years. Payments deferred until after harvest. $15,000. That was 3.5 years of net income for Vernon in a good year. Maybe 4 years in a normal year. "What happens if I have a bad crop?" Vernon asked. Gordon's smile didn't waver. "That's what crop insurance is for. Besides, with modern equipment, bad crops become less likely. You'll plant faster, harvest with less loss." Vernon looked back at his Oliver. "This tractor's never failed me when it mattered." "It's 19 years old," Gordon said, and there was something sharp in his tone. Not quite condescension, but close. "The Deere 4020 I could get you into would last another 20 years with basic maintenance. You'd be farming with equipment from the 1970s instead of equipment from the 1950s, There's a difference, Mr. Hastings. A big difference. After Gordon left, Vernon's wife Martha came out from the house. She'd been listening from the kitchen window. What do you think?" she asked. Vernon was quiet for a long moment. "I think that banker never planted a row of corn in his life. And I think every one of our neighbors is taking on debt they might not be able to service if things go sideways." "Things have been pretty steady," Martha said carefully. "They have," Vernon agreed. "But steady don't mean permanent." That summer, Vernon planted his corn with the Oliver. It took him longer than his neighbors. They'd roar past on the county road in their new Deers, covering ground fast, dust rising behind them. Vernon's Oliver pulled a 2-row planter methodically, carefully, checking depth constantly. At the feed store in Schuyler, farmers stood around talking about horsepower and hydraulics and financing deals. Some of them glanced at Vernon when he came in, and he could read it in their faces, pity mostly. Some amusement, the old-timer who wouldn't change with the times. But one conversation stuck with him. He was loading fence posts into his truck when he heard 2 farmers talking inside, their voices carrying through the open door. "Hastings is going to farm himself into the ground with that old Oliver," one said. Vernon recognized the voice. "Cal Henderson." "He's land rich and cash poor," another voice replied. "Too stubborn to modernize. Give it 2-3 years. He'll have to sell out." Vernon finished loading his posts, climbed into his truck, and drove home. He didn't say anything to Martha about what he'd heard. But that night, he went out to the machine shed and looked at the Oliver for a long time. Here's what the economic data was showing in 1971, and why it mattered. Farm debt in the United States had jumped from $24 billion in 1960 to $53 billion in 1971, more than doubled in just over a decade. The average farm operating loan had gone from $1,800 to nearly $6,000. Why? Mechanization, land expansion, the push toward what they called economies of scale. Everyone was preaching the same gospel. Get bigger or get out. Invest in equipment. Expand your acreage. Compete in the modern market. And for a while it worked. Corn yields were climbing. Export markets were opening up. But all that growth was being fueled by debt. Massive debt. And debt is a tool that cuts both ways. That winter, Vernon did what he'd done every winter for the past decade. He rebuilt the Oliver. He started in November, right after harvest. He pulled the tractor into the heated section of his machine shed and began with the obvious problems. The engine was burning oil. The clutch was slipping. The brakes barely worked. The electrical system was a mess of corroded connections. The hydraulics were leaking. Any one of these problems would have sent most farmers to the dealership. All of them together would have been reason enough to trade up. But Vernon saw it differently. He saw a winter's worth of work. He saw problems he could solve with patience and skill. He pulled the engine first, using a chain hoist his grandfather had installed in the shed rafters back in the 1930s. He found a rebuilding kit through a mail-order catalog out of Iowa. Cost him $87 or so, fortune for Vernon, but still a fraction of what a new tractor would cost. December came with brutal cold, the kind that settles into your bones. Vernon kept the wood stove stoked, burning oak and ash he'd cut from the fence line. Martha brought him coffee twice a day and never complained about the hours he spent in the shed, about the diesel smell that clung to his clothes. Vernon honed the cylinders himself. He fitted the new rings carefully, checking the gap on each one. He replaced the bearings, torqued the main caps to specification. The work was meditative, precise. Every bolt had to be torqued right, every gasket sealed properly. There was no room for shortcuts. The tractor would either run right, or it wouldn't. Dial stopped by on Christmas Eve with a bottle of whiskey and found Vernon in the shed. the transmission torn apart on the workbench. "You're missing the church social," Dale said. "I'll catch the next one," Vernon replied, examining a synchronizer gear under the work light. Dale poured 2 glasses, handed one to Vernon. "You know what I did today? I put fuel stabilizer in my Deere, covered it with a tarp, and I'm done until spring. 15 minutes of work, and I can spend the winter with my family." Vernon took the whiskey, sipped it. "You're a lucky man, Dale." "You could be too. That loan offer is probably still good." Vernon set down the whiskey and picked up the gear again. "The synchronizer's worn out. See here. Ground down from 19 years of shifting. I've got a replacement coming from a salvage yard in Kansas. Cost me $12. I'll install it, and this transmission will be good for another 20 years. Dale looked at the parts spread across the workbench, at Vernon's oil-stained hands, at the ancient tractor that was basically a pile of components. "What if you can't get it back together?" Vernon smiled. "I've been taking this thing apart since I was 14 years old. I'll get it back together." By February, Vernon was ready to reassemble. He installed the transmission first, then lifted the engine back into place with the chain hoist. It took 3 days to get everything bolted together, connected, adjusted. And then, on a gray afternoon in late February, when light snow was falling, Vernon was ready to start it. Martha came out to the shed. She didn't say anything, just stood in the doorway, arms crossed against the cold. Vernon climbed onto the Oliver's seat. He turned the key. The starter engaged. The engine turned over once, twice, 3 times. And then it fired. The sound was deep, strong, solid. The exhaust note was clean. No smoke, no misfiring. The engine settled into a smooth idle. Vernon sat there, feeling the vibration through the seat. And for the first time in months, he smiled. Martha was smiling too. She walked over, and Vernon helped her up onto the fender. And they sat there together, listening to the Oliver run. "Sounds good," she said. "Sounds perfect," Vernon replied. Spring came late in 1972. A wet, cold spring that kept farmers out of fields weeks longer than normal. When the ground finally dried, there was a rush to get crops in before the optimal planting window closed. Vernon's neighbors roared into their fields with their new equipment, running 14 hours a day, covering massive amounts of ground. Vernon took his rebuilt Oliver and methodically worked through his 420 acres. It took him longer, yes, but he planted every row at the correct depth, at the correct spacing. The summer of 1972 was brutal, hot and dry. By July, the corn was stressed, leaves curling in the afternoon heat. Everyone's crops were suffering. At the feed store, the talk turned pessimistic. Predictions of low yields, worries about making loan payments. But when harvest came that fall, Vernon's corn made 90 bushels per acre. His beans made 32. Dale's corn made 85 bushels. Jim's was similar. Ray's beans only made 28, instead of his normal 40. Vernon's numbers weren't spectacular, but they were better than his neighbors, and they were achieved with a tractor that hadn't cost him anything except time and parts. The numbers mattered because of what came next. In October 1973, the Yom Kippur War broke out in the Middle East. Within weeks, the Arab oil embargo slammed into the American economy like a freight train. Fuel prices doubled, then tripled. Diesel that cost 35 cents a gallon in 1972 was suddenly pushing past $1 a gallon by early 1974. The impact on agriculture was immediate and devastating. Dale Kirkman's John Deere 4020 consumed 6 gallons of diesel per hour under load. At the old fuel prices, that was about $2.10 per hour. At the new prices, it was over $6 per hour. Multiplied across hundreds of hours of field work, The numbers became crushing. Vernon's Oliver 88 consumed about 4 gallons per hour. But more importantly, Vernon adapted. The Oliver's simpler engine could burn lower-grade fuel. Vernon started mixing his diesel with reclaimed oil from the implement dealer's waste tank, something the newer tractors' fuel injection systems couldn't handle. But the fuel crisis was just the beginning. By mid-1974, the entire agricultural economy was unraveling. Commodity prices crashed as export markets dried up. Corn spiked to over $3 a bushel in the brief boom of 1973, then dropped back to $2, then lower. Soybeans collapsed from $12 per bushel to under $5, and the loans came due. Farmers State Bank started calling in notes. Gordon Clem, the enthusiastic young loan officer, was replaced by a harder man from Lincoln, a man named Tucker, who looked at numbers, not at people. Dale Kirkman missed his first payment in March 1974. His second payment in September. By January 1975, the bank foreclosed on his equipment. The John Deere 40U20, less than 4 years old, was repossessed and sold at auction for $4,200, barely enough to cover half the remaining loan balance. Dale had to give the bank a lien on his land to make up the difference. Jim Peterson lost his 4320. Ray Stoltz managed to keep his 4020, but only by selling off 80 acres. Warren Bickle went completely under, lost his equipment, lost his land, moved to Omaha to work in a meatpacking plant. According to USDA data, between 1973 and 1975, farm foreclosures in Nebraska increased by 63%. Equipment repossessions tripled. Land that had been selling for $500 an acre in 1972 was now barely fetching $300. Vernon Hastings kept farming. His Oliver, rebuilt and paid for, consumed less fuel than the newer tractors and required no loan payments. When parts broke, he fixed them. When the economy crashed, his costs didn't spiral because he wasn't servicing debt. In the spring of 1975, Dale stopped by Vernon's place. His truck was older now, rusty. He looked older too, thinner, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. Vernon was in the machine shed, the Oliver up on blocks, spring maintenance. "Vernon," Dale said from the doorway. They stood there for a moment. "I should have listened to you," Dale finally said. "About the equipment, about the financing." Vernon shook his head. "You couldn't have known what was coming. You knew enough not to take on debt you couldn't handle." "I got lucky," Vernon said. "That's all. But it wasn't luck. And they both knew it. It was caution, discipline, a willingness to work harder, to spend winters rebuilding, to ignore the pressure to keep up with everyone else." Dale looked at the Oliver. "You still running that thing every day?" Vernon smiled. "Better than most of the new equipment. Simpler, less to go wrong. When something does break, I can fix it." Dale nodded slowly. "I'm going to have to start doing what you do. Keeping equipment longer. Fixing instead of replacing." "It's not a bad way to live," Vernon said. The years after 1975 were hard for everyone. But Vernon made it through. He kept farming his 440 acres. He kept rebuilding his Oliver every winter. His neighbors started coming to him for advice. How did he keep the old equipment running? Where did he find parts? How did he manage without financing? Vernon shared what he knew. He wasn't possessive about his knowledge. In the spring of 1980, a young farmer named Tom Brewster stopped by Vernon's place. Tom was 24, just starting out, trying to make it farming 80 acres he'd inherited from his grandfather. "Mr. Hastings," Tom said, "I heard you might be willing to give some advice." Vernon set down his grease gun. "What do you need to know?" "I'm trying to decide whether to finance a newer tractor or to find an old one and rebuild it. Everyone says different things. My father-in-law says finance. The banker says finance. But I've been hearing stories about what happened to farmers in the 70s, and I'm not sure I want to take on that much debt." Vernon looked at this young man, at his earnest face, at the uncertainty there, and he saw himself 30 years ago. "Come here," Vernon said. He walked Tom around the Oliver, showing him the work he'd done. The rebuilt engine, the refreshed transmission, the new water pump, the replaced hydraulics. "This tractor's older than you are," Vernon said, "but it'll run another 20 years if I take care of it. You know why?" Tom shook his head. "Because when something breaks, I can fix it. Because the design is simple enough that I understand every system. Because I'm not paying someone else to keep it running. And most importantly, because I don't owe a bank a single dollar on it." Vernon let that sink in. When the crops fail, when prices drop, when things go wrong, this tractor doesn't care. It doesn't need a loan payment. It just needs fuel and oil and someone willing to turn a wrench. Tom looked at the Oliver for a long moment. "But it takes time. All this maintenance, all this rebuilding." "It does," Vernon agreed. "But you know what takes more time? Losing your farm because you can't make your loan payments. Working a second job in town because you over-levered yourself on equipment. Watching the bank auction off everything your grandfather left you." Tom nodded slowly. "Where do I start?" Vernon smiled. "Same place I started. Find an old tractor that still has good bones. Bring it home. Tear it apart. Learn every system. Rebuild it. And then take care of it." 3 weeks later, Tom stopped by again. This time he was pulling a trailer with an old Ford 8N on it. The tractor was rough, paint faded, engine seized, but the frame looked solid. "Think you could help me get started on this?" Tom asked. Vernon looked at the Ford, at the young farmer standing there with hope and determination in his eyes. And he thought about his father, who taught him everything he knew about tractors and farming and making it through the hard times. "Let's push it into my shed," Vernon said. "First thing we need to do is get that engine freed up." They worked together that afternoon, and into the evening. Vernon showed Tom how to remove the spark plugs, how to pour penetrating oil into the cylinders, how to be patient with seized metal. As he taught, Vernon realized this was as important as any crop he'd ever planted. This was how knowledge survived. This was how the old ways, the careful ways, the ways that didn't require massive debt, got passed down. Vernon Hastings kept farming into the 1980s. He eventually sold the farm to Tom Brewster in 1987, when Vernon was 60 and ready to slow down. Tom had saved up by then, farming carefully, maintaining his old Ford, building slowly. He bought Vernon's land outright, no mortgage, clean title. The Oliver 88 went with the farm. Tom kept it running for another 15 years. And when Tom's son eventually took over the operation in the early 2000s, that tractor was still sitting in the machine shed, still functional, nearly 50 years old. Vernon understood something fundamental that his neighbors didn't. The best tool is the one you own free and clear, that you can keep running with your own hands and your own knowledge. That principle worked in 1952. It worked in 1971. It worked through the farm crisis of the 70s, and it still works today. So here's what I want to know. If you'd been farming in 1971, would you have made Vernon's choice? Would you have had the discipline to rebuild that old Oliver while your neighbors drove brand new John Deeres? Or would you have financed the new equipment, taking the chance that things would work out? If you found value in this story, if you learned something about the power of financial discipline and self-reliance, then hit that subscribe button. Share this with anyone who needs to hear it. Because these lessons aren't just about farming. They're about life, about debt, about the courage to go against the crowd when everyone tells you you're wrong. Vernon spent every winter for over 2 decades rebuilding that 1952 Oliver 88. His neighbors thought he was behind the times, until the times changed, and his approach suddenly looked like wisdom instead of stubbornness. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.